Welcome back to the Phos Devlog series. This episode will be a bit different from usual. Since I didn't post a devlog last month, this episode will contain everything that was supposed to be in last month's episode, as well as all the new stuff that I've been working on. If anyone is new to the devlog series, this is the devlog from my RTS game Phos. I've been working on this game for about a year now. This month I have a lot of new things to share, so let's get right into it. These past 2 months marked a step forward towards the implementation of Tier 2 tech units and buildings. A lot of time was spent on the implementation of new building types and fixing lots of bugs. We'll leave the bug fixes aside for now and focus on the new buildings. The first of the new building types is a turret building. This building type will encompass standard turrets and artillery turrets. After implementing the functionality for normal turrets, I decided to make the models for the basic turret. Then while working on that, I decided to work on the model for artillery turrets as well. The model for artillery turrets turned out really well and is one of my favorites. Implementing the functionality for them, however, turned out to be a much greater challenge, and I've decided to leave it aside for now. Next, I moved on to implementing wall tiles. These turned out to be pretty simple to implement, and I think they look pretty good. That is, until you build them on rough terrain. As you can see, they don't really work that well on this type of terrain. I'm thinking of different ways to solve this. One thing for certain is that they will not be able to connect to each other when there's a significant height difference between tiles. This is where the future implementation of terraforming will come in handy. The more subtle problem to solve is when there is only a small difference in height between tiles. How do I make the walls look good and be seamless without compromising on performance? I'm still thinking about a solution to this, but nothing concrete yet. Phos currently has a pretty significant limitation when it comes to building shape and size. Buildings can only get bigger by growing equally on every direction. If I keep this as the only way for defining building size, buildings will get very bulky very quickly. They would also end up looking pretty boring. I would like to create very irregularly shaped buildings and have them be able to fit together almost like Tetris. To achieve this, I devised a building footprint system. This will allow me to define exactly which tiles a building will occupy and what arrangement they take. The actual code to get this working was remarkably simple, but creating the property drawer for the editor that allows me to define the footprints turned out to be much more significant of a challenge. I attempted to use Unity's UI elements to make the editor UI. But while trying to figure out how to use it, I ended up breaking my project by creating an editor window that prevented Unity from starting up. I spent several hours undoing the damage. As a result, I made very little progress on this front. I eventually came back to it and decided to use the older editor UI to make the window. I was now able to make rapid progress and finally got the system completed. This system will now unlock a lot more possibilities with buildings. Next, I decided to revisit turret aiming. The first order of business was to add support for a minimum range for all turret types. It is only used for longer range buildings for now, such as the newly added artillery turret. This new turret also uses a new method of aiming and firing projectiles. Artillery turrets fire projectiles in an arc towards its target. This gives them the unique ability to fire over obstacles such as mountains. Implementing this, however, was a significant challenge. I spent a lot of time trying to work out the calculations for the projectile motion. Once I got it working, however, it was well worth the effort. In the process, I also changed the way projectiles were assigned and spawned by turrets. A reference to the projectile asset is no longer needed. With turrets being pretty much completely implemented, I decided to move back to working on the footprint system. The footprint system needed one other feature to support its functionality. This was a new type of tile that allowed for the forwarding of events to a single tile. I call this tile a meta tile and it allows for multi-tile structures to act as a single tile. While the idea is pretty simple in concept, it's pretty tricky to implement. This is because of the redirecting of tile events. As a result, I expect them to be a potential source of bugs in the future. The next feature for me to tackle was factory buildings. These will be the buildings that allow for the construction of units. In order to construct units, I needed to modify the build queue system to support queuing units. Then I adjusted the build UI to be able to show units instead of just buildings. When you click on a factory building, it will then show the build UI with a selection of units to build. Clicking on a unit will put it into the build queue and trigger the build order. The only thing that's left to implement is the actual construction of the unit and displaying the animation. I'll be tackling that next month. I've also been working on a hefty share of bug fixes. These bug fixes range from small changes like fixing UI inconsistencies, issues with line renderers, and larger fixes like conduits not connecting correctly in certain situations. I've also worked on improving the stability of resource conduit connections. It should be a lot more stable, but there are still some issues to sort out. I've also finally managed to fix the friendly fire issues for units. Aside from all the major changes, I've also made several smaller changes. One of these is improvements to the underlying systems in Phos. Next, I updated the info panel UI to show the name of the current tile under the cursor. I also added a much needed feature to chunk rendering, a render distance limit. This works together with occlusion culling to reduce the number of chunks rendered, especially for FreeCam mode. I've also created 2 new building models, Fuel Refinery and Basic Unit Factory. The Unit Factory has no textures yet. I've also increased the size of the basic artillery because it didn't look quite right being that small. That concludes this extra long episode of the Phos Devlog. If you're interested in Phos, be sure to add it to your wishlist on Steam, and join the Discord server to get access to test builds. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more devlogs. See you next month.